Score more with the college-branded Venmo debit card and earn up to 5% cash back with Venmo Stash. Got paid back? With the Venmo debit card, you can instantly access your balance and spend on what you want, like game day snacks, gear, tickets, and more. The more you do, the more cash back you can earn. Plus, there's no monthly fee or minimum balance. Sign up now at Venmo.com/collegecard. The Venmo MasterCard is issued by the Bancorp Bank N.A. Select schools available. Venmo Stash terms and exclusions apply at venmo.me/stash terms. Max $100 cash back per month.
So good, so good, so good.
New spring arrivals are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Get ready to save big with up to 60% off Rag & Bone, Marc Jacobs, Free People, and more.
How did I not know Rack has Adidas?
Because there's always something new.
Join the Nordy Club to unlock exclusive discounts, shop new arrivals first, and more. Plus, buy online and pick up at your favorite Rack store for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you Rack.
For the News and Observer, I'm Dawn Vaughan, Capitol Bureau Chief and host of Under the Dome. You're listening to a special bonus episode, which we're recording Wednesday morning, November 6, 2024, the morning after Election Day. There were long ballots in North Carolina. We're going to get to the races at the top, and we'll still have our regular episode next week. I'm here with several of my colleagues across the area. From Charlotte, we have editor Josh Bergeron and reporter Brian Oehrli. From D.C., we have our Washington correspondent Danielle Battaglia. And in Raleigh, Avi Bajpai. Let's start at the top of the ballot with Danielle and the presidential race all year. You know, everyone was wondering, is North Carolina going to go for Trump or Harris? And we got our answer last night. So, Danielle, did it happen faster than you thought? Just tell me how it all played out last night with the presidential race.
I'm not sure faster than I thought. So it started with Vice President Kamala Harris taking a strong lead in the early votes, but these were the early votes, so we always know things are going to change drastically throughout the night. Within an hour, former President Donald Trump took over that lead and maintained it through, I think, 9:30. We saw the first call for it from the decision desk. We don't call until we see the Associated Press come, and that came, I think, about 11:18. I was on air with another news outlet, so I missed that call. Luckily, we had pre-written and was able to get it out pretty quickly. So, it was an interesting night, to be sure.
I mean, we're only just barely about 12 hours. We're recording this a little bit after 11. Not having, full data yet, but some. What have you seen of what this says about North Carolina voters picking Trump?
So we saw a strong push from Democrats last presidential election cycle. The state So trying to make this make sense, President Biden only lost North Carolina by 1.3%. It was the smallest margin that Trump had won by in any state that he had won in. And so they were trying to flip us blue. They had put in so much time, so many resources. They had surrogates here, not only on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis. Kamala Harris herself was here 21 times this election cycle. And it just wasn't enough to switch us to being a Democratic state. It eventually turned actually to a wider margin, with Trump finishing in the unofficial results at 3.39%.
We thought during the primary that, and I'll share more details about the governor's race soon, but it ended up being what was a possibility the whole year, that voters would pick, Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump and a Democratic candidate for governor, Attorney General Josh Stein, who ended up winning. Do you think it's almost kind of the norm in North Carolina to split ballots that way? Or is this just, an unusual situation this past decade?
I've been getting this question a lot since Trump won. And I think it's part of the reason we are considered a purple state. We do split that ballot. It was unusual. I mean, Donald Trump's been our presidential candidate for the 3 cycles that we've had this happen. And Roy Cooper was the gubernatorial candidate the 2 times prior, in 2016 and 2020. He has never lost an election his entire campaign season. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. So, he tends to go where he is going to win, and he bets well on himself. And so, it's not surprising to see him win his governorship. With Josh Stein, I mean, he was so far ahead in this race, even in the primary, that I'm not surprised to see the ticket split the way it did. I think the margin may have been a surprise to people, but not the fact that we split again and continue being the purple state that we are. It always makes us interesting.
Right. Well, let's segue then into the governor results. The other thing, too, that plays in, you talked about Cooper, and, we'd all written the speculation stories on one when he was, briefly considered as a potential running mate for Harris when she became the Democratic nominee. But would he get a cabinet position, that sort of thing? That's obviously not an option now. So people will be wondering, does this mean that he's going to run for something else? And again, he will do it if he thinks he can win, but that remains to be seen. One of his advisors I saw I went to the North Carolina Democratic Party watch party where Stein was last night. That was downtown, just across from the N&O. And Morgan Jackson was there. He was a key advisor to Cooper and also to Stein. And Cooper introduced Stein. And a lot of Stein's race, it's been, significantly about his opponent, Mark Robinson, who he defeated, but also about his relationship with Cooper. Cooper's a mentor and friend, and kind of continuing these policies that Cooper had that was worked, a lot of voters liked, obviously, for 2 terms. And then now we'll have Stein. Robinson was behind Stein for a bit. It would have, maybe a couple months ago, it would have been closer on election night until the CNN report, which Robinson filed a lawsuit later and denies the allegations and has a court date, the first court date coming up. So we'll see how that plays out. And everyone can read our coverage at newsobserver.com. We had people at all the different watch parties and talking to candidates and voters about how things went. So Stein, it seemed like, judging by the polls, he had a double-digit lead over Robinson. That ended up being the result. Attorney General was closer. People didn't know as much. There were fewer polls. The gap wasn't as wide, and it ended up being, between 2 members of Congress, Jeff Jackson and Dan Bishop. Ryan Oehrli in Charlotte covered the Jackson Bishop race. So did Avi here in Raleigh. Avi, why don't you go first and let people know about just kind of the contrast in these 2 men, these 2 candidates?
Yeah, I mean, both very prominent vocal members of Congress, 2 people who are well known in the state. But I think what is pretty striking about the results last night is that, I talked to both candidates in the last, 10 days or so before Election Day, and they were both kind of anticipating, bracing for a tight race, a very tight race. And compared to the last 2 attorney general elections, this was not that close, actually. 2016 and 2020, Attorney General Josh Stein, who is going to be the next governor, he won in both cases by less than 1 percentage point. And this race was decided by about 2.6 percentage points. So a pretty interesting result. When you take that into consideration with all of the other results for council estate, kind of a mixed bag. I think as of now, it's evenly split between both parties, winning 5 races apiece. It's interesting that, for Republicans were optimistic. They were hopeful that Dan Bishop would bring them across the finish line. I mean, Republicans haven't won. As we noted in our story, Ryan talked to Bishop supporters who mentioned this last night as well. Republicans haven't won an AG race in North Carolina since 1896, 128 years, and Bishop was not able to get them across the finish line last night.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, what was it like on the out in the field you were at Bishop's watch party? Is that right?
Yep, that's right. It was a pretty small setting. This was at some local restaurant in Monroe, and Bishop walked in. There were probably a few hundred people in there, kind of packed into this little restaurant and then a bar at the side. And Bishop showed up maybe an hour and a half or so after people started to get there, and he was just mingling with the crowd. A lot of these folks have known him for a long time because, of course, Dan Bishop's political career began in the 2000s when he served on the Mecklenburg County Board of Commissioners, and then he served in a number of other offices since. So these are folks who've known him for a long time. And this is a typical spot for election night parties in the area. And it was that kind of mood, just people having fun, enjoying some food, talking. And then over time, we noticed Bishop looking at his computer and watching the election results, sort of shaking his head, and then actually came out and conceded, I think, before we had expected that to happen, because it was still, from what we could see, fairly close. But around 11:10, he came out and he conceded and announced that he called Jackson.
Then Jackson gave his speech a fair amount later at that same, even though Jackson and Charlotte was in Raleigh at the state Democratic Party watch party there. Ryan is a reporter at the Charlotte Observer, our sister paper. Josh Bergeron is an editor there. Josh is editor and all of this. What do you see, broadly for Charlotte? And then we'll have another podcast talking more about other races, but we also really need to talk about Tricia Cotham, who appears to have won her race at this moment, at least. And I don't know if there will be a recount yet, but it's very close. And her district changed. Of course, Cotham switched from the Democratic Party to Republican and gave the legislature a full supermajority this past term. And it looks like we're just like currently potentially in the same scenario where they are one vote shy, depending on the final results of the legislative races, where the Senate maintained its supermajority and the House does not have one, but it's one vote. And again, the supermajority is 3/5 of votes, and that doesn't mean who is in elected office. It's who is actually in the room when they take the vote. So, Josh, I'll turn it to you for tell us, first about Cotham and how this race was like maybe different than people expected, and she was pretty low profile as a candidate.
Yeah, the race was first of all, the district was drawn to be a Republican-friendly district in a county where, for the past several years, John Bradford, I'm sure I'll get fact-checked on this, but John Bradford was, at least for the past 2 years, the only Republican member of Congress for Mecklenburg County. And so now potentially we might have two. There's another race that's very, very close, but certainly Tricia Cotham looks like she's won 270-something votes. Looks like she's going to hold on to that. Interestingly, I don't know if we have a breaking news sound here that we can play, but we got a text message from her campaign manager, and it seems like the campaign for the Democrat who ran against Tricia Cotham, Nicole Sidman, isn't ready to sort of concede yet. They want to go through the recount process. They want provisional ballots and mail-in ballots to be counted. And so we'll see about that. But it's specifically interesting because they mounted such a large campaign against Tricia Cotham, millions of dollars, $1 million raised by the opponent's campaign, which is a large amount for a legislature race. They really had a very strong door-knocking, ground game campaign. And, at the end of the day, Tricia Cotham looks like she's going to retain a seat in the legislature. And so the question ultimately is, how much did the way that the district was drawn play into the final results, especially because there was another 50-50 district to the north that the Democrat did win and won by a few points. And so, there was certainly a revenge-minded campaign by Democrats. Democrats certainly were motivated to try and kick Tricia Cotham out of office. And yeah, at the end of the day, they just fell short. And potentially maybe just the way the district was drawn.
We'll talk more about, council of state races in the next podcast and judicial races. But I wanted to mention, since we're talking about Charlotte, there are some wins and losses for the council of state. Where's the balance there now on who, about half and half wins and losses for the council of state candidates? Is that right? Jeff Jackson,
Yeah.
Josh, I think like Jeff Jackson was the win. It looks like Rachel Hunt, I think, of the final numbers as one, but then Braxton Winston lost labor, Natasha Marcus lost insurance. Is there someone I'm forgetting?
Elaine, you might have mentioned Elaine Marshall. Mo Green, certainly people were really interested in Mo Green. And Steve Troxler won. Interestingly, several of those candidates were from Charlotte. So there was potential that we would have a Charlotte Council of State, but looks like only Rachel Hunt and Jeff Jackson. But I think we were going to get a Charlotte Council of State either way with Dan Bishop versus Jeff Jackson. So,
all right. So regular listeners know we do Headliner of the Week. We're only on Wednesday morning now. So we're going to talk about our headliner of election night for the special bonus episode of Under the Dome. Let's start with you, Avi. What is your headliner of the night?
I'm just going to say overall, the fact that turnout was pretty strong. Lots of people went out to early vote. Lots of people showed up on election day. Based on just looking at the unofficial results from the State Board of Elections, it looks like we had a slight increase in the raw number of actual ballots cast, but because the number of registered voters is higher than it was in 2020, the actual turnout rate is a little bit lower. But I would just say the fact that turnout was high, and I'm grateful that results were in pretty quickly last night for the most part.
Ryan, what's your election night headliner?
Getting to cover a historic election. As someone who's more often in the courthouse, it was a nice experience, a nice change of pace.
Danielle, how about you?
One thing I'm watching really carefully that has not been decided is the majority in the U.S. House. We're trying to figure out if Democrats will flip it blue or if Republicans are going to maintain it. And several states are still out. So that's going to play very big into what happens in the next 2 months before our new members of Congress take over, and also what happens next cycle, and if Republicans can sweep the president, the Senate, and the House seats altogether.
All right, Josh, what's your election night headliner?
I'm going to go with a person for my headliner, Beth Helfrich, who's a candidate in NC House District 98. Beth Helfrich is a Democrat who ran against Republican Melinda Bales, and she won what was essentially a 50-50 district, including a lot of the Lake Norman communities, if you've heard of like Huntersville, Cornelius, Davidson. And so she was running in what was a 50-50 district and won by a little less than 5 percentage points. A relatively close race, but certainly a decisive race. And that was a district previously held by John Bradford. So headliner of the week being Beth Helfrich, because if the North Carolina House avoids a Republican supermajority, she would be a key part of that.
As we're recording this, I'll be heading off once we finish up, and maybe by the time you all are listening in a couple hours, the NC GOP is having a press conference with the legislative leadership, which is the Senate Leader Phil Berger, who won re-election, and Dustin Hall, who is the heir apparent to Speaker Moore, looking at the next 2025 legislative long session. But they still have 2 more voting sessions planned for this calendar year. My headliner was a pretty cool map I saw that the Washington Post did about shifts that use different blue and red arrows to talk about county shifts across the country. And I thought that was better than when you see just like one color for a whole state, because that doesn't really represent, the entire electorate. And just seeing the really like the shift in red to the right and how across the board that is. I'm sure there'll be plenty of analysis at our, state, local, and federal level for months and years. And as the next president comes in, and then they already start thinking about the next election. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening to this special episode of Under the Dome. We've had Danielle Battaglia, our Washington, D.C. correspondent, Josh Bergeron, editor in Charlotte, Avi Bajpai here on the Raleigh Politics team, and Ryan Oehrli, who was a great pinch hitter covering politics as well, of course, his regular beat. So for the News and Observer and the Charlotte Observer. I'm Dawn Vaughan. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
For more from our politics team, subscribe to the News and Observer at newsobserver.com/subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at Under the Dome and NC Insider, and sign up for our weekly political newsletter, also called Under the Dome, at newsobserver.com/newsletters. Thanks for listening.